The air in the store grew heavier, every second stretching into what felt like minutes. The seller, now shifting uncomfortably behind the counter, tried to regain control of the situation. "Look," he said defensively, "I didn't mean anything by it. She was just being difficult." But his words only fueled the quiet outrage in the room. The young man who had spoken earlier took a step closer. "Difficult?" he said sharply. "She's not just some random customer. Do you even know who owned this store before you started working here? You have no idea what you just did." His voice rang with a mix of anger and disbelief, but Mrs. Johnson gently placed a hand on his arm, signaling him to stop. By now, more people had gathered, drawn in by the commotion. The seller glanced around nervously, realizing he was losing whatever control he thought he had. All eyes were on Mrs. Johnson as she finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but carried a weight that demanded attention. "This store," she began, "was built on hard work, sacrifice, and a belief in treating everyone with dignity." Her words seemed to echo in the small room, and the tension rose even higher as everyone waited for what she would say next. The seller's face had gone pale, and it was clear he was beginning to understand the gravity of his mistake. But no one, not even the young man beside her, could have predicted what Mrs. Johnson was about to reveal. The officer's hand hovered at his side, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. The crowd, now pressing closer, seemed to fuel the moment with a collective energy, some holding their breath, others whispering among themselves. But the elderly man didn't flinch, his gaze unrelenting and calm, as if he carried the weight of 1,000 stories within him. "You think that badge makes you untouchable," he said, his voice echoing through the tense silence. "You don't know what it means to earn respect, to protect, to serve." The scar on his temple, now visible to all, seemed to tell a story of its own, a quiet reminder that this wasn't a man easily intimidated. The officer's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. The man's presence was commanding, and the murmurs from the crowd grew louder, shifting into an undeniable call for justice. What no one could predict was how this confrontation would end or the truth that was about to surface, leaving everyone, especially the officer, reeling. The officer took a step back, his confidence unraveling under the weight of the man's unwavering presence. Before he could respond, an older woman from the crowd stepped forward. "Do you know who this man is?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "He's a veteran, a community leader, and someone who's done more for this neighborhood than you ever will." The officer's face flushed as whispers of recognition spread through the crowd. The man stood silently, letting the moment speak for itself. The tension began to ease, replaced by a growing sense of accountability. Slowly, the officer lowered his gaze and muttered an apology, one that felt too small for what had transpired. The elderly man nodded but didn't linger on the moment. He turned to the crowd, his voice calm yet firm. "Respect isn't given by force, it's earned by how you treat others." The crowd erupted in quiet applause, and as the officer walked away, the man's simple yet powerful message lingered with everyone who had witnessed it. It started as a routine trip to the neighborhood store for an elderly black woman named Mrs. Johnson. Known for her warm smile and kind heart, she was simply looking to pick up a few groceries. But what unfolded inside the store was something no one could have anticipated. Tensions rose quickly when the seller, frustrated for reasons unclear, did something shocking. He hit her. Witnesses were stunned, but the real twist was yet to come. As Mrs. Johnson stood in disbelief, her strength and dignity intact, a revelation turned the situation on its head. The seller had no idea who Mrs. Johnson really was, or the connection she had to the very store he worked in. What happened next left everyone speechless and completely changed the narrative. Stay tuned to find out how this unexpected story unraveled and the powers. Johnson stood there, her hands trembling slightly but her head held high, as the small crowd in the store began to murmur. Who was this woman that seemed so composed, even after such an unjust act? And why did the seller, now looking uneasy, appear unaware of the storm brewing around him? For years, Mrs. Johnson had been a quiet presence in the community, always lending a hand, always offering a kind word. But what most people didn't know was her deep connection to this very store. It wasn't just any local business, it was part of a legacy, one that meant far more to her than anyone could have guessed. As whispers grew louder, the seller glanced nervously around the room. Something about Mrs. Johnson's unwavering gaze told him he'd made a grave mistake. But what he didn't realize was just how much that mistake would cost him the awful message it left behind. Mrs. Johnson stood there, her hands trembling slightly but her head held high, as the small crowd in the store began to murmur. Who was this woman that seemed so composed, even after such an unjust act? And why did the seller, now looking uneasy, appear unaware of the storm brewing around him? As the store fell into an uneasy silence, a young man stepped forward. He had been stocking shelves in the back, but had witnessed the entire scene. "Do you even know who she is?" he asked the seller, his voice firm but controlled. The seller, now visibly uncomfortable, shook his head and muttered something about just doing his job. The young man scoffed and glanced at Mrs. Johnson, almost as if seeking permission to speak. She gave him a subtle nod, her calm demeanor unshaken. The tension in the room grew as more customers whispered amongst themselves, piecing together fragments of the story. Many of them knew Mrs. Johnson, but few were aware of the history behind the store. Some recalled rumors about the original owner, a respected figure in the community who had passed down the business. Others wondered what the seller's reaction might be when he finally learned the truth. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson's silence spoke volumes. She wasn't just a customer. She was a part of this store's story in ways that were about to change everything. The seller's actions weren't just offensive, they had struck at something far deeper, something tied to a legacy he clearly didn't understand. What he had done was more than a mistake, it was a challenge that would soon demand answers.